from HSLDA. And we know that so many families have questions about attendance and how everything is going to impact us as homeschoolers. So we as an organization try not to give legal advice because we're not lawyers, right? So we leave the legal advice to the lawyers. So TJ, thank you so much for meeting with us today. We appreciate it.
Tara, it's my pleasure. It's glad to be here as we kind of work through these interesting times that we live in.
I'm sure you guys are being inundated with a lot of these types of questions. I know that you personally are responsible for, within HSLDA, I think 10 states. Is that correct?
Yep. Yeah, that's correct. So I'm responsible for Indiana along with 9 other states. And it's just how we've worked it out within HSLDA and the state contact load. And I've enjoyed serving homeschooling families in Indiana for, man, it's been probably 16 years, I think, now.
And as much as our heads are swimming here trying to keep this all straight, I can't imagine how it is to try to keep 10 different state standards in your mind right now.
Well, and things have changed, recently because of all the, governor's orders to suspend various laws. So it's definitely juggling act to try to keep up with everything. So, for years, understanding the homeschooling laws and regulations. Now we're, adding the wrinkle of, do any of these executive orders that are being issued across the country apply to homeschoolers? And I think that's one of the reasons why we're having this conversation today.
It is. So we're going to start with what is normal, and then we're going to work ourselves forward in the timeline of what has been happening over the past month. What is today? April 6th. Oh my goodness. Okay. 1 month. It's only been 1 month.
Sure.
So let's start with what is considered normal under Indiana law and homeschool families and how they are to track attendance. So what is normal for Indiana homeschools?
Well, so normally, and I'm sure most of your families already understand and recognize that when you're homeschooling in the state of Indiana, you're actually considered to be a non-public school or private school. And so normally, there's just only a couple provisions under Indiana law that apply. A lot of that has got to do with the case law, primarily State versus Peterman, that dates back to 1904, that basically the court said that a school at home is a private school. And so Indiana is one of those states that does not regulate private schools in exactly the same way as public schools. In fact, most states don't. And so there's separate guidelines that you would need to be aware of when you're operating a private school or a homeschool in the state of Indiana. Thankfully, the main requirements, the basic fundamental issues that you need to do is if your child is compulsory school age, and obviously, again, I think most parents would understand that that's when your child turns 7 until they turn 18 or graduate. There are basically 2 main things that you need to be, and the first fundamental issue is obviously to be provided instruction that's equivalent to that given in public schools. That doesn't mean the exact curriculum or instruction, but that's something that would be equivalent. Basically, the same subjects would be taught, and that there would be similar level of instruction based upon the child's needs and abilities. But the main, question that you're asking is, well, what about, actual attendance? And that's the primary thing that you are required to do. In fact, Indiana Code specifically says that all non-public schools are required to keep attendance records, and the purpose of that is primarily to verify enrollment and attendance of that student. Generally, the only entity that could request that information is typically the state superintendent or the superintendent of the school corporation in which you live in. So typically, again, the basic record keeping or documentation that you would need to do is those attendance records.
Right. And the state doesn't tell us how. And so for many of us, it can be as simple as check marks on our calendar, on our lesson plans. But, now we keep and we offer just basically a 1 page that is, so you can have attendance records that are separate. So just keep check marks, keep a count. So let's talk about, so we can do it however we want, but we often hear the phrase 180 days, which
Mhm.
I think is a great summary of the law, but it's not actually what the law says. It's probably the intent because it's probably the most common, but what does the law actually say?
Yeah, so and you're exactly right on the record keeping for attendance. It just simply says an accurate daily record. So how you keep it is entirely up to you. Each individual family does it differently. I've heard over the years of parents who just simply check off a calendar day, or they check off a a school planner, or they keep track of that information. It's really up to you. There's no limit on that. But looking at the actual 180 days. And so what we're referring to in this situation is the instructional days. So there are several different statutes, Indiana code provisions that state um, that public schools are required to keep 180 days. Now, as far as private schools or non-public schools, actually what it says, and you'll find this under Indiana Code 20-33-2-5. And I know you're planning to probably provide a lot of this information available to people so they don't have to try to frantically write this down, but we'll have links and information that'll be available to you. But under that Indiana Code provision, it says that all children who are compulsory school age are required to attend school for the number of days the public schools are in session in which the student is enrolled in Indiana. So, in essence, any child who's school age, and then again, that's someone between the ages of 7 to 18 or until they graduate, would be required to attend school for the same number of days that their local public school would be required to.
And so that's not something that we really worry about a lot, but it really came into play in March, which we'll get to in a minute.
Right.
One other piece that we want to discuss before we move forward to March 12th, and that is the definition of a school year. So while homeschools are private schools and there's really not a mandated school year for us, or we don't think we do, or a lot of people don't really talk about it, there actually is a definition of a school year in our state.
Right. Yeah. So there is. Indiana has defined under state law what a school year, and what we're talking about is just simply, for instance, the 2019 or to the 2020 school year, the school year that we're currently in. Under Indiana code, it specifically states that that is beginning after June 30th, in other words, July 1st, until before July 1st or June 30th. So the school year is defined under Indiana code as from July 1st through June 30th. Now, a lot of times parents, when I tell them that, they kind of concerned, well, does that mean I have to start and stop my, my year, whether that you mean your grade level that you're teaching or the start and stop date of your homeschooling program? You don't have to follow the same exact schedule as the local school corporation. Just keep in mind that for the record keeping purposes, the state considers 2019 to 2020 school year from July 1st through June 30th. And so any attendance that you're keeping in between those days is going to be counted for that 2019-2020 school year. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that you have to start, for instance, seventh grade July 1st. I know a lot of parents who, they typically start and stop their school years based on a calendar year. And so they start, January 1st and December 31st. And so you can certainly do that. Just understand that any kind of attendance record that you're keeping for is going to be seen as being the 2019-2020 school year from July 1st of 2019 through June 30th of 2020. So hopefully that is a little bit clear. Sometimes it can be a little confusing to people. And again, as you said, most of the time we don't really have to think about this. It's not something that we're organizing our daily schedule based on the local school corporation. It's just something to be aware of, that this is the school year as defined by state law.
Right. And I think for most people, it never becomes an issue. You can do it whenever, however you want to plan the rest of your schooling and your curriculum and everything else. But it just, why not meet the letter of the law on this one? That's our perspective.
Right. Sure. No, I understand.
So, all right. So let's go to March 12th, which was That was my birthday. It was a very odd birthday, I have to tell you. um, everything changed. Everything changed.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, a lot of things have been changing over the last month or two because of the COVID-19 coronavirus, novel coronavirus epidemic or pandemic that's been going on. So, March 12th, what was important on that day is the governor announced basically that there was going to be a 20-day waiver granted from 180 instructional day requirement. And that provision, if you're just curious, the one that applies to public schools is under Indiana Code 20-30-2-3. That applies specifically to school corporations. And the governor basically announced that he was going to be, or that the state was going to be providing a 20-day waiver. And so a lot of schools, just either completely closed down or took a break for the 20-day period. And the purpose or how this applies to homeschooling families is that, again, while Indiana code does not state that a private school has to do 180 days, it just simply says that you have to do the same number of days that the local school corporation has done. So any school corporation that took 20 days, and I'm not aware of any that did not, you would then automatically be able to apply that to your homeschooling program. The one thing, though, that I would encourage parents is that, for most of us as homeschooling parents, we as parents were planning on directing our children's education. And, we expected to be covering a full year. Now, I think the homeschooling community, we're involved in a lot of different activities. It, used to be that, people were just doing homeschooling only in their homes. In fact, when I was raised and we were educated at home, there weren't any really co-ops that were going on in the, early 80s and sometimes even late 80s. There weren't that many co-ops that are out there. But nowadays, I mean, I think of just my wife and I homeschooling our own children. We have a small co-op class with a couple of friends for science. For one of my children, another science class for my other child. We do music lessons outside of the home. We do other regular activities, and all of that has been put on hold because of the coronavirus. And so I think we've had to change and adjust. But my point is that we were expecting to have to do a full year of work. But given what Indiana has done, they've waived the 20-day requirement. You also could potentially, if needed, have that 20-day waiver as well for your homeschooling program. Personally, my encouragement would be that, if there's something that impedes your ability to do all the instructional days that you were intending to your child, then you do have some flexibility now given that 20-day waiver. But March 12th is kind of the beginning of some of these changes that we're going to be talking about. So that's when the governor declared and the Indiana Department of Education declared that there was going to be a 20-day waiver that would be granted from the 180 days. So for this school year, for 2019 through 2020, June 30th, 2020, no longer is a requirement of 180 days. It's basically now we're at 160.
Right. And I would say that I want, without talking about the law for a moment, I think I want to say something about just having grace with each other and our community.
Sure.
When that waiver first came out and we had families asking about it, you would see a lot of comments on different sides. And there were families who were saying, well, I don't need a waiver. I don't need, why would you want a waiver? We're homeschoolers and we should strive for excellence, which is absolutely true. However, many families have been thrown big curveballs in their life. And there are families who, reducing the number of days is going to be very beneficial to them. So I think as a community, we always want to strive for excellence, but we should also strive with grace.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree with that. And I think a lot, I think the struggle has always been for parents who, when they consider the 180 days is, well, we accomplish what we set out to do for this whole year in less than 180 days generally. And so I fill, 10 or more days with, field trips, or trips to museums or the zoo or other activities, which are great. Unfortunately, we're not so much able to do that now,
Right.
and so this 20-day waiver does certainly provide some alternative options, and still, as I think both you and I mentioned, allows parents to complete what they're able, and in many ways what they planned on doing.
Right. So things changed again. So
Hmm.
1 week later, the governor issued new orders. I think we've all learned we have to be very flexible these days.
Right.
So what happened on March 19th?
So on March 19th, the governor issued Executive Order 20-5, which made several different changes to government policies and procedures. But the main ones that we're going to be um, interested in would be he closed all schools until May 1st. Now that's since changed, but he also canceled all state mandated assessments. And so that was the main effect of the March 19th executive orders. Not so much that there was a lot of impact on us as homeschooling, other than any co-ops or any other programs, I would have assumed likely would have closed as well, because it applied to all public schools, all private schools, and not that a co-op is a private school per se. In fact, I would argue that a homeschool co-op providing 1 or 2 day a week programs is certainly not a private school. But given that the governor issued that order, I would expect by that time that all co-ops who had not closed by that time likely would have closed about that same time.
Right. And again, that was really focused on just limiting interaction with
Right.
families and children. So,
Hmm.
okay, so we can move on to last week. So April 2nd, the
Right.
governor once again had some new orders for us. And let's talk about where we currently stand, because I think this is really what's in place for the rest of
Right.
the school year for us.
Right. And again, we're obviously just talking about this today on April 6th. There could be, and I'm going to talk about a couple different things here in the executive order that the governor issued on April 2nd, that there could still be a few additional changes coming down the pike, but I'm going to kind of outline what those could potentially be. So in Executive Order 20-16, the governor basically issued an order saying that remote learning for the remainder of the year, basically no more schools were going to be providing any in-person instruction in any public school across the state, whether it be public or charter school or any public educational entity. So remote learning for all students. And that was going to take effect. And then the second part of the governor's order was that school corporations can either do one of two things. They could either complete the 160 days of instruction, because again, we've dropped from 180 to 160 now. Complete the 160 days of instruction by the end of the school year, or provide at least 20 additional days of learning between now and the end of the school year. So that basically, in effect, says that schools could be closed in as little as 20 additional days from April 2nd.
And so we know that what the state is dealing with is just so vast. There's a lot. It sounds like some of this might be incomplete and, oh, this doesn't apply to me, but we have to, I think, kind of rely on the intent.
Mhm.
They're dealing with a lot. And, some families might think, well, this doesn't apply to me, but we should be very aware of it no matter what. So,
Right.
um,
Well, and yeah, and the one thing that I wanted to kind of add as far as what's going to happen. So in this order, the governor issued a requirement that all school corporations by April 17th are going to have to inform the Indiana Department of Education of how they're going to finish out this year. So either that they're going to do 160 days of instruction, or they're going to do at least 120 additional days. If they do that 120 additional, I'm sorry, not 120. If they do the 20 additional days, all remaining days that they may have would be or could be waived by the Indiana Department of Education. So at this point in time, we don't know which school corporations are going to go for completing 160 days. And we don't know which school corporations are just going to try to do at least 20 additional days. How this will impact individual homeschooling families, again, because Indiana code says that you're only required to do the number of days that your individual school corporation does, you could potentially have the option of even completing less than 160 days. Now, again, I think both Tara and I are suggesting that our goals as homeschoolers is obviously the education of our children and a level of excellence. We're not necessarily using the public schools as our measuring stick here. Just understand that under Indiana code, you would only be legally required to do the number of days that your local public school is done. So for those parents, maybe there's a family that, because of the COVID-19 crisis, they're not able to do everything that they planned on doing. This will give you some leeway potentially. Certainly I hope none of the homeschooling families in Indiana get impacted directly by the COVID-19, but that's certainly possible. I knew of a family in Florida that father traveled overseas. He came back with COVID-19, and his son and other children were impacted by COVID-19. So it could be that there's, because of this crisis, whether it's a COVID-19 or other illness, that could impact your ability to finish the school year as strong as you originally intended. And so again, these provisions are going to allow you some excuse. But again, we won't know until April 17th what school corporations, what their choices are going to be. They could either finish out 160 days or they could do it at least 20 additional days. We do know that they will have to inform the Indiana Department of Education by April 17th. And then by June 15th, each school corporation will certify to the Indiana Department of Education that they have completed what they planned on doing, whatever their goal was on April 17th. So again, we'll just have to wait and see. It could be that your school corporation decides to go with only 20 additional days. So that's kind of where we stand at the moment.
So I think that for our families, what's the smart choice right now? Keep going and at least do 20 days from last week.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would suggest that for those parents who are able to obviously finish out their school year, whether that's 180 days, 160 days, that's what I would typically recommend is that you just finish out your school year. You had a plan in place. You may have to modify that plan. And this, what we've kind of laid out here today, it does give you some options on how you can get some leeway from maybe what you were originally intending on doing. But my encouragement would be is to finish your school year. At the very least, right now, or at the most, I would say that you are going to have to do would be to be able to demonstrate that you've done 160 days. It could be that you'll be able to only have to demonstrate at least some amount less than that. Again, each school corporation's schedule is slightly different, so it's not clear and when they stopped, when they took their break, their spring break, or when they stopped counting instructional days. So it's not always there's not a uniform number of the local school corporations at what number they were at, whether they were at 120 days or 130 days of instruction so far. It's not clear exactly what your school corporation is, but by April 17th, we will know because they have to submit a revised calendar. And so you'll be able to know what your school corporation's number of days is going to actually be. And as long as you do at least that amount, you will have satisfied Indiana code. But again, I think both Tara and I are encouraging you to finish strong and complete the home education program as much as possible to what you envisioned and planned for this day. But this gives you some options and alternatives as well.
So, we're really talking for the most part to our homeschool families who are already homeschooling. at least by the beginning of March, before all of this happened. And I
Sure.
think take a little bit of time to, if you have any thoughts for families who their children were in public school. And
Hmm.
what we're seeing is there certainly are families who are withdrawing their students now.
Right.
It really started in mid-March,
Hmm.
which we always have families that withdraw their student this time of year anyway. But now a lot of families who just they're not wanting to continue with the distance
Right.
learning that their school is putting out there for whatever reason. Uh,
Right.
and so if anyone is looking at home education because of this crisis, we welcome
Right.
you to our community. But for those families who are just wanting to put, I guess, a halt to the distance learning or the requirements that their public
Hmm.
school currently has on their student because they are still enrolled and they're just trying to put an end to that,
Sure.
what would you recommend for those families if maybe they don't even have curriculum, which we've
Right.
got great resources and different things, but do you have any
Right.
specific advice to those people?
Yeah, so I mean, I can give you some general information. I would always encourage, and I know Tara as well, if you have some specific questions about your individual circumstance, know that you can reach out to IHE or to HSLDA so that we can provide you with, some specific information on your individual situation. But, like you, I've heard from a number of families that are trying this as a trial run for homeschooling. I just was talking with late last week a family in Florida, one of my other states, and has two children. Thinking about homeschooling, was planning on homeschooling next year, but because of the COVID-19, this kind of accelerated her timetable. She knew that her children would not do very well on the online distance learning. She didn't really think that the computerized instruction was going to really fit their needs for their individual kids. I know I've talked with some families here locally. My wife and I, we live in West Virginia, just over the border from Virginia, where HSLD's main office is in Northern Virginia. And some of these families in West Virginia have had to make sure that their children checked in online between 6 to 12 times a day
Wow.
in order for them to keep up with their online instruction. And then was reading an article out of California. Los Angeles has had over 15,000 kids who haven't been able to log on at all since the publication of that. And a lot of that has to do with either inability to get access to internet or other complications or issues. So I think parents are definitely making a decision to try out homeschooling, to kind of cut the cord for the rest of this school year. And you do have that ability. Um, and as Tara mentioned, there are a lot of resources out there. I know a lot of educational companies have provided free resources that are available to parents. Many different states are partnering with many of these educational programs. Certainly, if online instruction, though, is not for you, there are other options as well. Finding, textbooks or printed material, whether you get that from online and you print it out for your child, or if you want to go with more of a textbook program. I'm sure that there are ways in which we can help try to get those resources to you. And of course, curriculum providers, the homeschooling community has dozens, if not hundreds, of curriculum providers. And I know, Tara, obviously, IHE has partners with a number of vendors that they can, you all can get them in connection with if you have a need for some specific textbook, traditional material. So if you're wanting to begin homeschooling, you're wanting to kind of cut that cord, you definitely can do that. For the rest of the year, we can help you in kind of making a smooth transition and supporting you along the ways. And I know that a lot of families are considering that because, again, they're either overburdened from the kind of requirements that the state is saying that you have to do a certain amount, or it's just that this distance learning model is just not going to work very well for their situation, their family, their child.
Right. And I would say one other thing to those families who maybe are withdrawing and looking at home education for the first time. I think one of the things that we saw was the entire world embrace the word homeschooling. And I would say that people need to know this is not what normal homeschooling looks like as you mentioned before, most no homeschoolers are not at home, and we're all
Right.
stuck. Everyone is stuck right now. Everyone's fighting for the internet. We're all in close quarters.
Yeah.
So we're so, it's wonderful for so many people to get this opportunity to spend more time with their family and to test the waters with home education. But some of the
Mhm.
frustrations that families are probably experiencing right now are not homeschooling. It's, stuck at home schooling, which are kind of
Right.
different things.
Right. Yeah. No, I think the homeschooling community, this is taking a toll on us as well as I've already mentioned, and you've mentioned as well. Um, while certainly I think homeschooling means a lot of different things to different families. No homeschool program is the same as your friends or neighbors, and I think one of the biggest challenges for those who are new to homeschooling is their concern or fear that they need to try to replicate what was going on in the public school in their home, and that's certainly not what you would need to do. Um, I know when my mom began teaching myself and my siblings at home, she had was not a certified teacher, but she'd gone to school to be a teacher, and so she had some of these ideas in her head that she needed to create that public school type environment. And I think one of the benefits of homeschooling is you don't have to do that. And in fact, I think learning can occur on so many different ways and so many different mediums that you may just need to decompress and just look for exciting ways. Some of the things, I mean, obviously, for our homeschooling program, it's changed a little bit. My kids are taking music lessons via Skype. They were just doing the violin lessons this morning. They'll be doing piano on Thursday, all via Skype. Some of their science programs they've moved to do, and these are, we do the science instruction in our home, but then we got together with some of our homeschool friends, families, to do some of the science experiments like chemistry or other biology experiments. We're doing those over Skype. A little bit challenging, but there's so many different options out there. And so I think really our goal and desire, I think both IHE and HSLD, is to really support any family who's wanting to uh, take homeschooling for a spin and see if this is something that meets the needs of your family. Um, and yeah, we are spending a lot more time together, but it's great. I mean, even in our neighborhood, I see, families who send their kids to private school or to public school. They're spending a lot more time together, and I think that can only be good. Maybe it'll help us work together on resolving conflicts, but I think it's a great thing for everyone to kind of take a pause.
Yeah, I think a lot of families are possibly finding a lot of freedom in
Hmm.
this option and in this time in our country. Someone had pointed out, because we obviously watch the Indiana Department of Education's website, and they have a lot of resources,
Hmm.
schools and families dealing with these challenges. It was very interesting to see the Department of Education talk about the time requirements for distance learning and how
Hmm.
much shorter it was. And even the
Yeah.
Department of Education does not think that you should be sitting down and doing school for 8 hours a day,
Hmm.
because that's what a brick and mortar school day might look like. So
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. In fact, I'm chuckling because so one of my other states is New Mexico, and last year we had an issue where the public education department, the PED, was trying to state that homeschoolers had to do minimum number of hours, and we're throwing out numbers like 6 hours a day and more. But they just recently put out the maximum hours, but for public school students who are now working at home, but maximum hours as in you cannot do more than this. And those hours range from 30 minutes for kindergarten to second graders or 3 hours for high school students. So, in other words, their advice now is that you can no longer shouldn't do more than 3 hours a day for your high school students. So it seems, many in the homeschooling community are kind of chuckling because, we these are things that we kind of knew a long time ago, and it's interesting to see the public school community coming around to the fact that you can do a lot more work in less time,
Yeah.
and that it's better.
Yes, yes, it is. Well, okay. Well, I think we answered the majority of the questions that that we had, or that I had kind of planned for us. And we will certainly, we're going to take this video, we're going to keep it archived for families so they have
Mhm.
access to it. And I'm going to include the notes, all the things that you had shared with us, TJ,
Sure.
and share them with everybody. And if they have additional questions that we didn't come up with, we'll be sure to get answers.
Sure.
And we'll come back to you, and you can keep us informed.
All right. My pleasure. And Tara, it's always good to talk with you. Let me know if there's anything that we can do. And certainly our goal here at HSLD, and I know at IHE, is to help families, as they are educating their children at home. So let me know if there's anything else.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody else. And we will see you again soon.